All right, welcome back to the second lesson in the second series of Intro to Java Programming. Today's video, we're going to pretty much be talking about the two different types of loops that you can be handling in programming and what a loop is. So to get started, we're back with our simple program to enter a length and a width and calculate either perimeter or area based off of what the user prefers. So understanding loops is better done visual than it is to rather explain it, because in theory it's very simple, but in pragmatic situations it's a little bit better to see it, because it's harder to implement it when you're first getting started with it because you're not really sure how to implement it. So there's, like in programming, so many uses for loops, both while and for loops. Most commonly in my experience, I've used for loops a majority of the time, whereas while loops kind of take a back seat for the most things that I encounter in my programming experience. But it doesn't mean that it's not important to at least know about a while loop. So we will get started here, and what we're going to do in this case to implement for and while loops isn't necessarily make sense for what this program does, but it's a good way to understand simply what the loops do. So in these if statements where they're calling the get perimeter or get area method, we're going to implement a for loop right before those so that we can manipulate one piece of data. And I'll explain. So the first thing I want to manipulate is the length input. And again, there's really no reason that you would do this if this was an actual program, but just for the sake of teaching for loops. So you're going to start out by typing for, and you're going to open the parentheses, and we need to set a beginning variable, or value rather. So we'll start with an integer, and we'll say int I is equal to 0. That'll be our baseline point for where the for loop starts. And then you need to do a semicolon, and we need to set the range of this value. So let's say I is less than or equal to 3. And then we need to increment this value. So now we have to say I plus plus. What that'll do is that'll increment the value one time, one integer each time it loops through this for loop. So it'll say int I is equal to 0, 0 is less than or equal to 3, and then it'll continue through the program. And then when it's done through the program, it'll increment it 1, so it'll say I is equal to 1, even though it'll still be written here as 0, but it will be represented as 1 then, and then I is still less than or equal to 3, or 1 is still less than or equal to 3. Do what's in the for loop, and then it'll do the same thing, and you'll get up to I is equal to 2, and you'll actually get up to I is equal to 3 because it's less than or equal to 3. And then once it gets to 4, the for loop will stop. So now we're going to open the for loop, and this is where the action gets done for whatever it is that you want to do. In this case, what we'll do is we'll change the value of length to be, I don't know, let's say times 2. All right, so there's two ways to write this. Length is equal to, and we need to have a baseline value here, but because we're doing length, we need to actually say the value itself. So length, because we're multiplying it by itself. So we need to say length, and then we'll say times 2, but and then end it with a semicolon. But you'll see that this little line pops up underneath, and it says assignment length equals 2 is replaceable with operator assignment. So what that means is there's pretty much a better way to write this in syntax. So a lot of programming languages will implement this. I don't know any that don't, but will implement the syntax to be read such that it's, instead of length is equal to length times 2, it'll just be length times equal 2. That stands to represent length is equal to length times 2. Means the exact same thing, just written a little bit differently. So what this will do in this series is it will iterate through the for loop, and each time it does, it'll multiply the current length starting with the base input length and multiplying it by 2. And it'll continue to do this until I is equal to 4, because when I is equal to 3, it'll still loop through and do the multiplication here. So the other one we're going to implement, that's pretty much all there is for a for loop. It's really simple, but it's just understanding it in a pragmatic sense so you can implement it the best way possible. The other one is a while loop. So while, you need to start with an incrementer that's previously set typically. So for this, we'll say int I again, and we'll say is equal to 0. So while I is less than or equal to, and we'll do the same thing that we did up here, so you can see how they're used pretty much for the exact same thing. But while I is less than or equal to 3, now we do the action. But in the while loop, we're going to have to increment this I because there's no other way to do it. So we'll have to do I plus plus, similar to what we did up here. End it with a semicolon, and now we'll manipulate the width. So like we were talking about previously, you can do width is equal to width plus let's do 2 again. We'll just do 2, but this time we're doing addition rather than multiplication. So again, you're going to get this little yellow line typically underneath. If you have the correct error settings, you can change that in the preferences piece of this software, but it's going to give you this little underline that says you can write it better, essentially. So what we'll do is we'll write it better. So you'll do plus equals to 2. Exact same thing as up here. It's just that the operator is different. You're doing a different series of arithmetic math, but down here you're doing plus equals 2. Very simple, very straightforward, and this is the end of the while loop. See, they're not very complicated things to use for the most part, but once you start getting into different types of data structures and iterating through different algorithms, whether it's sorting or finding lines of best fit for paths or some sort of thing like that, they become very complicated when you're dealing with large data structures. But understanding them at a very basic level helps you build on the skills that you have. And understanding arrays that we'll cover later, it's important to understand how you can iterate through them using a for or a while loop. And like I said before, typically I use for loops, but while loops you can see pretty much do the exact same thing. It's just that they require syntax that's a little bit more spread out, whereas in a for loop it's pretty much straight across the board. So we'll run this, we'll show you that it works, and yeah, so let's get started. We'll save it and then we'll run. So let's do perimeter first. So you can type in a length and click enter. We'll do 2, and then width we will do 4. Now typically this would return 2 plus 2 is 4 plus 4 plus 8 is, so it'd be 12 as the perimeter, but it's going to return a bigger value, 72. So what it did was it took the length value that we inputted as 2, and it ran through the for loop because we selected perimeter. So it ran it through the for loop rather than the while loop for area. So it said while integer is, it said for integer equal to 0, less than or equal to 3, I plus plus, length was 2 times 2, it was 4. But because it ran through 1, 2, 3, 4 times, the length got multiplied by 2 4 times. So it came out to like 8 or something, and that and then added with the width allowed us to get the perimeter of 72. So same thing pretty much would happen if we ran the area. I'll just run it so you can see that it works, but they're pretty much just doing the same thing, just different mathematics and different syntax. So area, type in length, it'd be 2, type in a width, it'd be 4, area is 24. So I hope you enjoyed learning in this video. I hope you learned something new, and I'll be back with a new video tomorrow.